The sobs came from his kitchen at 3 in the morning, soft and broken like a wounded animal trying not to be heard. Samuel Garrett stood in his bedroom doorway, bare feet on cold floorboards, listening to the sound that had pulled him from restless sleep. He'd hired the girl 2 weeks ago when she'd appeared at his door like a ghost in a tattered dress, claiming she could cook, and asking for nothing but shelter and meals in return. He'd said yes because his own cooking was killing him slowly, beans and hardtack wearing holes in his gut. But mostly he'd said yes because something in her dark eyes reminded him of the daughter he'd lost to fever 3 winters past, the same quiet desperation that said the world had already taken everything worth having. Now he crept down the hallway, avoiding the creaking board by the stairs. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see her silhouette hunched over the table, shoulders shaking with the effort of staying quiet. Moonlight through the window caught the wet tracks on her cheeks. In her hands she clutched something small and dark, a photograph, he realized. Her fingers traced its edges like she was trying to memorize what was already lost. Samuel had learned not to ask questions. In this country everyone carried ghosts, and most folks preferred to let sleeping devils lie. But watching her cry over that photograph stirred something in his chest that had been buried alongside his own family. The girl couldn't be more than 16, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, like she'd been living on hope and air for too long. She'd been a good worker, better than good. His meals had become something to look forward to instead of endure. She moved through his house like morning mist, there when needed, invisible when not. She never spoke unless spoken to, never asked for anything extra, never gave him cause to regret his kindness, but she also never smiled, never hummed while she worked, never showed any sign that she was anything more than a pretty ghost haunting his kitchen. Tonight was different. Tonight the careful walls she'd built around herself had cracked open, and the sound of her grief was filling his empty house with something dangerously close to life. Samuel knew he should turn around, go back to bed, let her have her private moment of sorrow, but his feet carried him forward anyway, drawn by an ache he thought he'd learned to ignore. She looked up when his shadow fell across the table, her eyes wide with the caught animal fear of someone who'd learned that witness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her face quickly. "I didn't mean to wake you, Mr. Garrett. I'll be quiet." She started to rise, to slip away like she always did, but something in his expression stopped her. Samuel pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "What's that you're holding?" Her fingers tightened on the photograph. "Nothing important. Everything's important at 3 in the morning. His voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Especially the things that make us cry." She stared at him for a long moment, weighing risks behind those dark eyes. Finally she turned the photograph so he could see. A family, mother, father, 2 small children, smiled back at them from better days. The girl in the picture looked younger, softer, untouched by whatever had carved the hollows from her cheeks. "They're gone," she said simply. "Cholera took them last spring. I've been alone since then." Samuel nodded, understanding more than she knew. "What's your real name, child?" "I know it's not Mary Smith like you told me." "Elena." The word came out like a prayer. "Elena Rodriguez. Where are your people, Elena?" Her laugh held no humor. "What people? I'm the last one left." She touched the photograph again. "I keep thinking maybe if I stare at this long enough, I can go back, make it so none of it happened. Make it so I'm not alone." Samuel finished. Something passed between them in the darkness, an understanding born of shared loss. Samuel had buried a wife and daughter. Elena had buried everything. They were both survivors of different catastrophes, learning to breathe in a world that had taken their reasons for living. "You don't have to be alone," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You don't understand. People like me, we don't get to stay anywhere. Someone always finds out, always decides we don't belong. People like you, Mexican, poor, nobody." She said it like it was a disease she carried. "Sooner or later someone in town will start asking questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And then you'll have to choose between keeping me and keeping your good standing with folks who matter." Samuel leaned back in his chair, considering. He'd never thought much about what others might say. This was his land, his house, his choice, but he understood her fear. He'd seen good people run out of town for less. Outside, a coyote called to its pack, and Elena flinched at the sound. Everything about her was wound tight, ready to run. What if they didn't have to choose? Samuel asked. The riders came at sunset 3 days later, dust clouds announcing their approach long before Samuel could make out their faces. Elena saw them first from the kitchen window, and the plate she'd been drying slipped from her hands, shattering against the floor like her composure. "Mr. Garrett," she called, her voice carefully controlled, but her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from experience. Samuel stepped onto his porch, shading his eyes against the dying sun. 5 men, riding hard and purposeful. He recognized the lead rider, Tom Brennan, who owned the general store in town and served as unofficial spokesman for the decent folks who liked their world ordered and predictable. The others were local men, farmers and merchants Samuel had known for years, men who'd helped him bury his family, who'd brought food during the dark months after. They pulled up short of the porch, horses snorting and stamping. Brennan's face was grim, the kind of expression that preceded difficult conversations. "Sam," Brennan nodded, "we need to talk." "Light down then. Elena just made coffee. It's about the girl we need to talk." Brennan stayed mounted, and Samuel understood the message. This wasn't a social call. "What about her? Word's gotten around town about your new help. Folks are asking questions." Brennan's voice carried the weight of community concern. "Mexican girl shows up out of nowhere. No family, no references. Some folks think that's suspicious." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Suspicious how? You know how. These are dangerous times, Sam. We got Apache stirring up trouble to the south, bandits crossing the border, cattle thieves working these ranges. A girl like that could be scouting for any number of bad elements. She's 16 years old enough to carry messages, old enough to count livestock and note routines." This from Jake Morrison, a rancher whose spread bordered Samuel's. "My wife saw her in town last week, asking questions about who lives where, what routes the supply wagons take." Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "She was buying supplies. I sent her, maybe. Or maybe she was mapping our defenses." Brennan leaned forward in his saddle. "Look, Sam, we all respect what you've been through, losing Mary and little Catherine the way you did. It's natural you'd want to help someone in need, but you can't let grief cloud your judgment." Behind him Samuel heard the soft sound of Elena's footsteps retreating into the house. She was listening, hearing every word that painted her as a threat, instead of a frightened girl who made his coffee strong and hummed Spanish lullabies while she worked. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Send her on her way," Morrison said bluntly. "Tonight, before she brings trouble down on all of us." The other men nodded agreement, faces set with the certainty of people who'd already decided what was right. Samuel looked at each of them, men he'd called friends, men he'd trusted with his life more than once. "And if I don't?" The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what wasn't being said. After the riders left, Samuel found Elena in her small room, packing her few belongings into a worn canvas bag. She moved with mechanical precision, folding her extra dress, tucking away the photograph, gathering the pieces of a life that had never been allowed to take root anywhere. "You don't have to go," he said from the doorway. "Yes, I do." She didn't look at him. "I heard what they said. They're right, you know, about people like me bringing trouble. I should have moved on already. People like you." He stepped into the room. "What people are those, Elena?" "The unwanted ones." She closed the bag with shaking fingers. "The ones who don't fit anywhere, don't belong to anyone. I'm used to it." Samuel watched her for a moment. This girl who'd brought life back into his empty house without him realizing it, who'd mended his torn shirts without being asked, who'd planted flowers by his front door, who'd made his kitchen smell like cinnamon and hope again. "My daughter would have been about your age now," he said quietly. Elena's hands stilled on her bag. "Catherine, she had your way of moving quiet through the house, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Mary used to say she was born apologizing for existing." He leaned against the doorframe. "I used to tell her she had as much right to be loud as anyone. Took me 2 years after she died to realize I never learned that lesson myself." Elena turned to face him, something careful and fragile in her expression. I've been living quiet too, Samuel continued, keeping my head down, not making waves, letting other people decide what's right and what's wrong, but watching you pack that bag, seeing you get ready to disappear because someone decided you don't belong. It reminds me that keeping quiet isn't the same as keeping peace. They'll make your life difficult if I stay, maybe, but they'll make my life empty if you go. He pulled something from his pocket, a small wooden cross, carved with careful hands. This was Catherine's. Mary made it for her when she was small. I've been carrying it around like a talisman, like if I held onto it tight enough, I could bring her back. He held it out to Elena, and she stared at it like it might burn her. I can't take this. Why not? Because it's not mine, because I'm not her, because I'm nobody's daughter anymore. Samuel stepped forward and gently pressed the cross into her palm. Maybe you could be mine. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any formal adoption papers, more binding than any legal document. Elena's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. Papa, she whispered, trying out the word like she was afraid it might crumble, and Samuel felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 3 years finally begin to thaw. The confrontation came at dawn, just as Samuel expected it would. This time Brennan brought more men, 8 riders carrying the authority of collective righteousness and the impatience of people who'd given fair warning and been ignored. But Samuel was ready for them. He stood on his porch with Elena beside him, her small hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She wore Catherine's cross openly now, silver against her brown throat, and her chin was raised with something that looked remarkably like defiance. Last chance, Sam, Brennan called out. Send her away, or we'll do it for you. She's not going anywhere, Samuel replied. This is her home now. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was waiting this long to make it clear where I stand. Samuel's voice carried across the yard with quiet authority. Elena is my daughter now, legal and proper. Any man who has a problem with my family can take it up with me directly. Morrison urged his horse forward. You can't just adopt some stray and expect. I expect, Samuel interrupted, that decent Christian men would welcome a child who's lost everything and found shelter with someone willing to give it. I expect neighbors would be glad to see an empty house filled with laughter again, and I expect friends would trust my judgment about my own family. Elena squeezed his arm, and he could feel her trembling despite her brave front, but she didn't step back, didn't try to hide behind him. Whatever courage she'd found, she was determined to use it. Look at her, Samuel continued, his voice gentler now. Really look. She's 16 years old. She's been alone for months. She cooks better than any of your wives, works harder than most of your sons, and asks for nothing but a place to belong. What exactly about that threatens you? The silence stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. Samuel could see it in their faces, the slow recognition that maybe their fear had made them cruel, that maybe their certainty had blinded them to what was actually standing in front of them. Brennan shifted in his saddle. If trouble comes because of her, then I'll handle it, same as I'd handle trouble that came because of any member of my family. One by one the riders turned their horses away, not with apologies that would come later, if at all, but with the grudging acceptance of people who'd pushed as far as they dared, and found the push returned with interest. As the dust settled behind them, Elena sagged against Samuel's side like a marionette with cut strings. Is it over? She whispered. It's over, he confirmed, pulling her close. You're home now, for good. Years later, when Elena had children of her own playing in the yard where she'd once planted flowers with trembling hands, she would remember that morning as the moment she learned the difference between shelter and home. Home, she would tell her daughter, wasn't about the walls that kept you safe, it was about the people who chose to stand beside you when those walls were tested. The last thing visitors saw when they left Samuel Garrett's ranch was always the same, an old man and his grown daughter working side by side in the garden, their heads bent together over something growing, their quiet conversation mixing with the wind that carried stories across the endless prairie.